My name is Masoud Mohaved. I am an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I have been studying income inequality and intergenerational income mobility, as well as wealth inequality from a comparative and historical perspective using quantitative methods. If I were to show you a broad trend in income inequality, you will see that there is a rise in the levels of income inequality across the developed world. Whether you look at Australia or Austria or Finland or Japan, United States, the famous cases, everywhere you look at in the developed world, with the exception of one or two countries, income inequality has risen over time, over the past 60 years. And that has invited a number of explanations by economists, by political scientists, and by sociologists. The first and foremost is skill bias technical change. What it suggests is that there is a mismatch in the levels of skills required in the job market because of technical change and the kinds of skills that people who are seeking those jobs have. Because the technical changes pace has been so rapid, there is a mismatch, and premiums are to those who are more catered towards computer use and software use and things like that. So there is a bias in what the job market favors in terms of premiums of wages. If you're a computer scientist, if you have skills when it comes to software use, your income and your wages are highly likely to be higher compared to others. So that's the bias that economists, very famous ones, highlighted back in the 80s and 90s. The second explanation by, again, economists and also political scientists, as well as sociologists, is the decline of organized labor and the ever weakening of employment protections across the developed world. My explanation of income inequality in this paper is under the umbrella of this decline of organized labor, generally, the power of working class. So that's the second explanation. The third explanation is changes in compensation practices. Thomas Piketty was one of the prominent scholars who highlighted this in that famous book, New York Times bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century. In which he highlights how some of the hedge fund CEOs, some of those financiers set their wages independent of market forces. They have incredibly handsome income compared to others, and the compensation practices of certain people, of the top earners, are just so different. Their trajectory is so different compared to the rest. The fourth explanation by demographers and by sociologists is changes in family formations and the phenomenon of assortative mating. Across the developed world, highly educated men end up marrying highly educated women. And because of their income, because we look at, in most Gini indices that we have, we look at household income. And if you're looking at a measure of inequality at household level, you will see how education premiums play a role. Highly educated, highly skilled men marrying highly skilled women. So their household income will be significantly higher. So this idea of associative mating plays a role, and demographers have shown this, that it does. There is a wage differential. So these are the prominent and most visible explanations of the rise of income inequality over the past 4 or 5 decades. My study was centered on the notion of power. Working class power has two sources. If you look at the notion of power, the definition of power from historical perspective, from the time of Roman philosophy, ancient philosophy, up until scholars have paid attention to power, defining power. For example, Max Weber, one of the founding fathers of sociology, defined power as the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his will despite resistance, right? That's one definition of power. The great political economist, the political scientist, Robert Dahl, said that A has power over B to the extent that if you get B to do things that B wouldn't otherwise do, right? To get an actor to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, that means you're wielding power over them. Generally, there's a lot of common denominator of all these definitions of power is that power is that which makes the achievement of desired outcome possible. If you're able to, you exercise power when you're able to achieve desired outcome. And working class power has been heavily discussed in historical sociology, in comparative sociology, in political science literature, and a whole body of literature on welfare states, for example, by Josta Esping Anderson, deep down has this idea of working class power. And the political parties that were affiliated with working class made certain things possible for the society. If you ended up having some kind of welfare provisions or employment protection, these were the function for this welfare state literature, were the function of struggles from below by working class through struggles, but also through class struggle, through strikes and activities that allowed them to wield power, but also through political parties. The prominent cases are the Scandinavian countries, where there is a significant working class party that defends the interests of the working class. Yet, despite this visibility of discussions of working class power, unions have declined everywhere in the developed world. Everywhere you look at, there is a sharp decline. With varying degrees, there's a decline in the levels of union density. The share of workers that were unionized at some point in the 60s or 70s or 80s is now significantly less. In the US, it's barely 11%, 12%, right? So there's been a decline in unionization across the developed world. This decline of union density across the developed world has had calamitous consequences for its constituents. Right? There are consequences that were so deleterious for the masses were largely attributed to declines of union density. So what are those calamitous consequences? One of them is the rise of income inequality. It's famous and everyone knows that. Second is the stagnation of welfare spending, stagnation in the levels of welfare spending. Third, the drift of social democratic parties. If you're a political scientist and you want to think about party politics and their preferences, the drift of social democratic parties towards the center. This has been shown in some of the recent political science work, and I have cited them in the paper as well. So these are only three among other consequences that we have seen as a result of decline of union density. Earlier, I mentioned that working class power has two sources, structural power and also associational power. This distinction is not new. I did not make this distinction. This distinction was around for some 40 years. In fact, my late advisor, one of the most prominent sociologists of class analysis in the past century, Eric Olin Wright at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, through collaborative work with Luca Perrone and others, defined and clarified and elaborated this dual distinction, this dual dimensions of working class power. So let me define them in precise terms, according to Eric Wright's definition of working class structural power and associational power. Associational power refers to various forms of power that results from the formation of collective organizations. If you think about unions and workers' councils and strike activities, all of these are instances of associational power. You put pressure on employees by association, through associations. Without association, you can't. If everyone upholds or withdraws from one day of work, that can have tremendous effect in some of the sectors. And you cannot do this. You cannot wield that power if you don't resort to collective action. So that's the associational dimension of it. The second definition, I think it's really critical, and people should think more about this structural power, is defined as the following. Structural power refers to the power that workers drive simply from the location of workers within the economic systems, from in-demand skills or employment in a key sector in a given national economy. So let me give you micro-level examples and also more macro-level examples. If you are a software engineer at a company and there are certain things that you can do and others cannot do, right? There are certain niche job-specific skills that you have and others do not have, then you have a lot of power. Just by the virtue of your skills and being in that location within the economics, within the sectoral division, you have a lot of power, right? Certain skills, certain things that you can do that others cannot do. That employers, for them to succeed, they're dependent on you. That's a micro-level example of this. I always give this example. We have RAs sometimes, research assistants, that collaborate with us. There's always that one RA that writes this beautifully annotated push-button script for you that you don't have to debug later in the world of quantitative research. Once you press once you click that, the whole code runs beautifully without any errors. That RA, a lot of on that RA because he delivers the best that could be delivered to people, right? To collaborators. That RA, you would do whatever you can to keep that RA in position. If he asks or she asks for a month vacation, you try to accommodate, right? Because you know that the next one that comes, there's no guarantee that will deliver this kind of high quality work. You could think about this example as structural power. There are certain things that some people can do at micro level that others cannot do. Thinking about this in cross-national and comparative perspective, there are certain sectors that were so vital to overall economic health and dynamism. Manufacturing, mining, transportation, and one more that I'll come to in just a second. These major sectors were shown time and again that they were vital in the overall dynamism and growth of national economies. For national economies in the past century to do well, these sectors had to do well. None of the, in post-industrial, in the course of industrial development, post-industrial development, these sectors were so key in providing skill formation, in developing people's ability to be highly productive, and they were key sectors. They were shown to be key sectors. So workers in those sectors ended up having a lot of structural power because these sectors had to do well for national economies to do well. And if these sectors were not doing well, national economies were not competitive, right? So location, your presence in those key sectors mattered to give you, endowed you with some power that other sectors did not. Like services did not give you that kind of power. Working in forestry or fishing industry did not give you that much power. Working in those highly productive and highly in demand sectors mattered so much. So that's the distinction of associational power and structural power. Associational power is the one that you drive through association and by association. Structural power is the one that your location within that sector and within that economic system allows you to, endows you with certain power. So if this is the case, then we have two sources of power. How can we think about providing or offering a quantitative assessment of which one of the two matters? Do both of them matter in terms of egalitarian outcomes? Is it the case that the strike activities of workers, let's say in a country, workers were more combative, they went on a strike more frequently, did that matter as much as the other one, structural power, matters? This is the premise of this study, and I ask simple questions. I say, to what extent does structural versus associational power of the working class matter for distributive outcomes in the context of the global north, in the context of the developed world? Does associational power have an impact as much as structural power does on the degree of social and economic inequalities we observe across the world? Which type of working class power matters? Can we adjudicate which one of them matters more or less for income inequality cross-nationally? So these are the questions that motivate the paper. I draw on panel data analysis. I pull data and merge them from a variety of sources, including OECD. I construct this panel data, and then I also rely on ILO's strike data and also sectoral data, and then I merge them. I use two-way fixed effect model because that produces the most conservative estimates so that I can do away with any sort of confounders that can bias my estimate. Two-way fixed effect is widely used in comparative research with panel data, and I draw on that methodological strategy to generate the estimates. And then I also rely on something that's called counterfactual simulation. I conduct counterfactual simulations in quantitative sense. So let me say something about counterfactual simulations in qualitative research and also in quantitative research. Historical sociologists exercise qualitative historical sociologists exercise counterfactual simulations. For example, in historical accounts of some of the revolutions, for example, if an event, this is proposed by many scholars, if an event didn't happen, the outcome would have been different, right? This is a hypothetical example of how you would exercise in counterfactual thinking with qualitative assessment. Were it not for a coup in so-and-so country, the outcome would have been different, right? Were it not for a military strike in one country, there would not have been that many lives lost. It's just based on a logical assessment of what would the world look like were it not for a given event. The logic of that in quantitative research is also very similar. What would the world look like if I simulate a country similar to another? Like if I say, if the United States had working class power as much as the Finnish society has or the Danish society has, what would the levels of income inequality be in the US? You can provide this simulated, this fictitious world in effect and see the difference. You know, everything else being held constant in econometric sense, you could also see the difference. It's a strategy, an analytical strategy that allows you to make comparison with this counterfactual, quote unquote, fictitious world. I measure associational power by the rate of strike. It's a widely known measure of associational power. Basically, the number of strikes divided by total civilian labor force multiplied by 100,000. That's the rate of strike. And then I also demonstrate the patterns of strike activities. So strike rate in historical patterns shows variation across the world. Finland by far has had the highest rate of strike activity. So the Finnish working class has been by far the most combative in the developed world in terms of the number of strikes that they have gone on. Second to that is perhaps Australia, Denmark, some of the notable cases, New Zealand, etc. And then I demonstrate the relationship, descriptive account of a bivariate scatter plot of the Gini coefficient on the y-axis and then the associational power of the working class on the x-axis. The relationship, there is not much of a relationship descriptively when you look at that. And then I also measure structural power of the working class. And the way I measure it is precisely the way it's defined, the share of working class in high capacity sectors, manufacturing, mining, construction, transportation, as opposed to all other sectors. So workers in all other sectors in the denominator and workers in those high capacity sectors in the numerator. That gives you the share of working class in high capacity sectors. So far, this is the the descriptive analysis of the paper, and people can refer to the paper to see the econometric analysis. What are the negative, positive predictors? I won't bore the audience with those details because they can refer to the paper. But the meat of the results, the core tenet of the results is the following: that both structural and associational power of the working class negatively predict income inequality. They're negatively associated with income inequality. But the one that matters to lower income inequality and has a larger effect size is the structural power and not associational. And I show this through a series of counterfactual simulation. If you look at this slide titled Counterfactual Simulation, I isolate two cases, Italy and Spain. And then I demonstrate that if every country, like if these two countries had structural power as much as Switzerland has, because Switzerland had by far on average the highest level of structural power. If Italy and Spain had a structural power as high as that of observed in Switzerland, income inequality would have been significantly lower. If every country in the global north, every country across OECD countries had structural power over the past 40 years, as high as that of Switzerland, income inequality on average would have been between 3 to 4% lower on the Gini index. Right? So if United States or Canada and Switzerland and Spain and Portugal and Australia and New Zealand and England had structural power as high as those observed in Switzerland, income inequality over the past 40 years on average would have been lower, significantly lower. Like 4% on the Gini index is tremendous. That means a lot more equality in the world if you have 4% less on Gini index. A lot of people would be more better off in terms of distributive outcomes, right? If you have those outcomes. But this is not what we observe. This is just a counterfactual assessment. If they had it, they did not have it, but if working class power, structural power, was as equal to that of observed in Switzerland, income inequality would have been significantly lower. Is this the case when we do the same kind of counterfactual simulations with associational power? I do the same kind of two-step comparisons. I isolate Italy and Spain, and then I say, if those two countries had labor force as combative as that of observed in Finland, remember I said Finland had by far the most combative labor force in terms of going on strike. If workers in Italy and Spain had demonstrated combativeness as high levels observed in Finland, it would not have made a difference in the levels of income inequality, because the observed trend and the counterfactual trend of income inequality are almost overlapping, right? And you can see this in this slide that I have. And then I do the same kind of analysis. These were for two countries specifically just to illustrate. They were serving illustrative purposes. Now, if I demonstrate this on average, you will see that if every country had combative force, labor force, as high as those observed in Finland, it would not have made a difference, much of a difference in the levels of income inequality over the past 40 years, since the 80s. If you notice, the observed levels of income inequality and the counterfactual levels of income inequality are almost overlapping. So even if I could imagine a world where every country had a labor force and those workers went on a strike as frequent as they went in Finland, it would not have made much of a difference in the levels of income inequality. Everything else accounted in this model taken into consideration, controlling for all other factors that are in the model. Right. So that's the virtue of this counterfactual exercise, net of all the factors I considered, and I considered quite a bit of them. I considered globalization, I considered net migration rate, I considered population, I considered GDP growth. I took all of the things, the usual suspects that people consider into account, net of those. Even when you incorporate that in a model, a two-way fixed effect, you could see the difference. You could see that how much the difference in the levels of structural power and the impact it has on income inequality compared to associational power. The study wanted to complicate and wanted to adjudicate which source of working class power matters for income inequality from a comparative and cross-national perspective. I use panel data analysis, two-way fixed effect, to adjudicate and to try to understand which source of working class power matters for income inequality. I consistently find that a structural power matters in terms of effect size. It really drove egalitarian outcome. It drove, if we had in some countries more equality compared to others, what I'm finding is that the structural power of the working class, net of everything else that I've accounted, mattered so much. It affected that outcome significantly more than associational power. Counterfactual simulations show that the levels of structural power in Switzerland, if every country had structural power as high as those observed in Switzerland, income inequality on average would have been up to 4 percentage point less on the Gini index over the past 40 years. up to 4%. The main contribution of the paper is that it's the first cross-national study to simultaneously test associational power and structural power of the working class, using counterfactual simulations to understand which one of them mattered. We know that working class, a lot of people had said that working class power drove inequality or drove equality. It lowered income inequality. In every comparative study using panel data, in every econometric study, scholars have shown that working class power negatively predicts income inequality, whether Gini index or any other inequality index. But what we try to understand here is that which source of working class power? Strikes are different source. Lockouts and withholding and withdrawing your work and your participation in work is one source of power. Your location within the economic structure is quite another. Which one of the two matters? And what I find is that the structural power of the working class matters because the impact that we see through counterfactual simulation in that what would be the levels of income inequality, where it's for higher or lower levels of structural power, shows a much wider gap than that of associational power. Thank you.